You are listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today I want to talk to those of you out there who can relate to the following quote. A woman came up to me after a talk I gave, and she said this. She said, Adam, I'm intrigued by what you're saying about exploring my story, but I didn't experience anything traumatic growing up. She said, I know people have experienced real trauma, and those things didn't happen to me. I was raised in a good home with loving parents. However, something is not right inside of me, she said. And to make matters worse, I don't think I should feel this much pain since nothing that bad ever happened to me. And then she ended with this sentence: I don't feel like I have a right to be as messed up as I am. Now, whew, wow. I just want to pause after reading that because it is so common and so important. Let me repeat her last three sentences. Something is not right inside of me. And to make matters worse, I don't think I should feel this much pain since nothing that bad ever happened to me. I don't feel like I have a right to be as messed up as I am. Now, this sentiment is not uncommon, but it is crazy making for you. It's bad enough to feel emotional pain inside. However, emotional pain becomes agonizing when you don't feel like you should be feeling the pain in the first place. So, are you someone who feels, emotional pain inside, but you have this sense of, I don't think I should feel this. Nothing that bad ever happened to me. I don't know what to attribute this pain to. Trauma is pervasive in this world, and sin is a real thing. Nevertheless, many people have this sense that my story isn't that bad. And that's what I really want to address today. In Jeremiah 6 and 8, this is a passage I come back to often. God indicts the leadership of Israel for deceit. And this is what God says: prophets and priests alike all practice deceit. They dress the wound of my people as though it were not serious. Peace, peace, they say, when there is no peace. Now, what is the text saying? What's God getting at? Well, God's saying that the leadership of Israel, when he says prophets and priests, it's the whole leadership apparatus of Israel. They practice deceit, and deceit refers to deceiving someone by concealing the truth. How are the leaders, in this case, concealing the truth? They are refusing to take the wounds of the people seriously. They're saying, peace, peace, everything's fine, when everything is not fine. And here's my point. Sadly, this is what many of us do with our own wounds. We are often like the leaders of Israel back there in Jeremiah 6 and 8. We don't take our wounds seriously. We deceive ourselves into believing that everything is fine when everything is not fine. Peace, peace, we say. We say it to ourselves, but there's no peace in our bodies. We have symptoms: anxiety, fear, depression, rage, relationship problems, problems with our kids, problems with our spouses, problems with God. There are so many ways in which our bodies are saying, it is not well with me. But instead of listening to the symptoms in our bodies, we often dress our wounds as though they are not serious. Most of us have at least fragments of memory about painful things that happened to us during our growing up years. However, instead of being curious about how these wounds may still be affecting us today, we say things like, that happened 30 years ago. I should be over it by now. Or that happened when I was in elementary school. I really don't think it's affecting me today. It is very common, in other words, to believe that your story isn't that bad. But notice something. The reason you hold this position is because you are comparing your story to the stories of others who you believe had it worse than you. And all I can say is this: why, for the love, why would you compare your story to another person's story? And what if comparing your story to someone else's story actually prevents you? It gets in the way of you exploring your past, your story, your life, your heart, your body. If your friend has two broken legs, it doesn't make your broken arm hurt any less. So why would you ignore your broken arm simply because your friend has a worse wound? Anytime you say, my story isn't that bad, anytime you say some version of that, you are minimizing your wounds. You are dressing your wounds as though they are not serious. Peace, peace, you're saying. Everything's fine. But everything's not fine. Everything's not fine. There is no way to make it through childhood into adulthood in this world without experiencing harm. I'm not saying everyone experiences trauma, but all of you have experienced harm, which means, what does that mean? It means that the neurons in your brain have been shaped by painful experiences, harmful experiences. It's affected the neural circuitry of your brain. It's affected how you see the world. Since your brain was most shaped during childhood, the experiences that you had with your primary caregivers, mom and dad, whoever raised you, stepdad, stepmom, whoever it was, those experiences have had a very big impact on your neurons. Now, believe it or not, but your parents, the people that raised you, your caregivers, were and are sinful people. This doesn't mean that they're bad people. It simply means they are human like you. It also means, however, that you were raised by caregivers who harmed you to some degree. I understand that it can be very difficult to look at how your primary caregivers, who likely provided goodness also, perhaps lots of goodness. So I understand how it can be difficult to look at how those people who provided so much goodness also did harm. There's something very disorienting about coming to see one's parents as flawed human beings, because as children, we tend to idealize them. I'm not asking you to ignore the goodness of your parents. To be honest about your parents is to be willing to name both their failures and their deep, deep goodness. However, in my experience, most people, the vast, overwhelming majority of people tend to focus on the good things that they received from their parents, and they tend to ignore or minimize or dismiss or discount the ways that their parents did harm. So, how did your mother's sin, her failure, her humanity wound you? How did your father's sin affect you? Because it did. That's simply the consequence of being raised by someone other than Jesus. Larry Crabb wrote a book years and years ago called Inside Out, and I only remember one sentence from it, but it's an important sentence, and it's simply this: sin is a bigger problem than we think. In other words, what's the point? Sin does damage. Sometimes that damage is severe, and sometimes it is slight. But sin cuts into the heart. It affects the neurons in our brain. When your father harms you severely, it's like a grenade goes off and shrapnel lodges in your body. If you don't attend to that shrapnel and gently dig it out, your body cannot heal. But conversely, or alternatively, as my wife Caroline points out, when your father harms you slightly, not severely, but slightly, It's like a splinter embeds in the ball of your foot. Now, the splinter may be small, but it can change the way you walk. And that's a very helpful analogy. Thank you, Caroline. The point is that all past harm, both large and small, affects your present life. If you are committed to the narrative of, my story isn't that bad, I had a great childhood, nothing that bad ever happened to me, it may be because you are minimizing your story. You're minimizing what actually happened to you as a boy or a girl. And I don't know how else to put it. It's almost guaranteed that you are minimizing your story. Now, how can I say that even though I don't know you? Because I can't think of a single person who has come into my office and done the opposite, okay? Someone who believed that their story was affecting them more than it actually was. I've just never encountered someone who who framed it that way, who saw it that way. Everyone that I have worked with, personally, professionally, just in life, including me, minimizes their story, minimizes their wounds. Minimizing means that you are dismissing or discounting how significantly your growing up years have shaped the neurons that filter every experience you have today. Minimizing means that you don't really believe that your story as a boy or a girl continues to profoundly affect your thoughts, your feelings, your behaviors today. Okay, so what does it look like? Minimizing might look like the following. Your friend is sharing a painful story with you. And suddenly she says, but I shouldn't complain. Look at so and so who is struggling with so much more adversity than me. What's happening there? Your friend is starting to feel her painful emotions because she's sharing her story. She's getting close to the ground level detail of it, and she's starting to feel some big feelings. And then she exits that process by comparing her story to someone else's story who she believes has more adversity. This comparison, this shift, this move that she makes internally is very functional for her. In other words, it functions to allow her to temporarily escape feeling her own pain and her own big feelings about her own story. Second example, as you are reflecting back on some of the ways that your mom hurt you, suddenly you catch yourself thinking, but my mom had a really bad childhood, far worse than mine. So I shouldn't be hurt from my childhood. Now, what's going on in this case? Again, you are beginning to feel some legitimate pain. You are dressing your wounds with the seriousness they deserve. That's what's happening at the beginning. And then suddenly you exit that process by saying, but my mom had it way worse than me. And so who am I to feel hurt? Or who am I to complain? Or who am I to suffer when my mom's childhood was so much worse than mine? Again, look, if your mom had 2 broken legs in the past, why does that mean you should ignore your broken arm today? Third example, at a men's retreat, you are asked to share a story of harm from your growing up years. And one participant responds by saying, when I think back on my childhood, I don't really have any harmful moments. I mean, my parents got divorced when I was 11, but it wasn't that bad. I don't really have any trauma. I remember having to tell my mom that my dad was having an affair, when I was 11. And after that conversation, that's what led to my mom divorcing my dad. But those were probably the only bad things that ever happened to me. No one ever hit me. I was never sexually abused. I certainly don't have any experiences of trauma or anything like that. And that's how he ends his time of sharing. Do you see how this man is minimizing the heartache of his story for an 11-year-old boy to tell his mom that his dad is having an affair? Why didn't this man think of his story as traumatic? Why didn't he categorize this experience in his growing up years as trauma? And it's simple. We all tend to minimize the harm we've experienced. It's natural and it's automatic. For this man, okay, having to tell his mom about dad's affair, that was just normal for him. It didn't feel like an aberration. It didn't feel like something bad. It was normal for him to be put in between the two of them and to be put in unresolvable binds like that. So, of course, he didn't think it was harmful to his 11-year-old heart. Anytime you compare your story to someone else's, you are minimizing your story. Okay? Anytime you compare your story to someone else's story, you are engaged in the process, the act, the crime of minimization. You're dressing the wounds of that boy or girl as though they were not serious. Now, the sentence, my mom had a bad childhood far worse than mine, it may be 100% true. It may be completely accurate. However, you can use that sentence as a way of escaping the heartache of your story. Just because your story doesn't include a daring escape from a totalitarian regime in a war-torn country doesn't mean it is unworthy of engagement. All right? Just because your story is not the worst story out there doesn't mean it is unworthy of engagement. Here's the bottom line, in my opinion. You don't want your painful experiences to have affected you as much as they have. And therefore, you don't give your stories the weight that they deserve. Let me say that again. In my opinion, minimization more often than not is because we don't want the experiences that we suffered to have affected us as much as they did. We don't want them to still be affecting us. And so we don't give those stories the weight they deserve. You don't want that jerk who hurt you so much as a child to still be affecting your life 20, 30 years later. But anytime you compare your story to someone else's, you are escaping the heartache of your story. What's keeping you? Here's the question. Look, here's the question. What's keeping you from having tenderness and compassion for that 11-year-old boy or that 14-year-old girl? Why do you insist on dressing the wounds of that boy or girl as though they were not serious? And what would it look like to begin to give his or her stories more weight? Because God gives them weight. Another way you may be minimizing your story is by spiritualizing the bad things that have happened to you. Now, what does that mean? All I mean by spiritualizing is anytime you use theology or the Bible to avoid feeling your big feelings, to stay out of your body, to avoid grappling with what actually happened to your heart, mind, and body when you are a child. Anytime you do that, you are spiritualizing away your pain and the harm that was done to you. Have you ever used theology or the Bible to minimize the harm that was done to you? If you have, it's quite likely that you came by this practice very honestly. The majority of evangelical churches are highly, this is not a compliment, are highly skilled at creating environments in which the harsh realities of living in a sinful world are spiritualized away. I mean, this is common practice. It happens every Sunday morning in every state of the union. Here's how Dan Allender puts it. It's so succinct and it is so gut-wrenching. Dan simply says, the truth is largely lacking in our world. And he's right. The truth is largely lacking in our world, which means that very few people tell the truth. Very few pastors, very few professors, very few TV anchors, very few therapists. The truth is largely lacking in our world. So suppose you have written a story about one of the times that you were harmed as an 8-year-old girl, and you read that story to a friend, and your friend engages with you and names how hard that experience must have been for you as an 8-year-old girl. And your friend is really with you in it. She's feeling it. And as soon as your friend says, that must have been really hard for an 8-year-old girl to bear, you immediately respond with, yeah, it was hard, but I can see how God used that time and that experience to draw me closer to him and to shape my character. What is going on in that moment in your brain? What's happening inside your brain and your body? Most likely, you have begun to feel the discomfort of very painful, unfelt feelings, and that is overwhelming your system. And to lessen the overwhelm, you attempt to disconnect, to get some distance from the painful emotions by saying, God used that experience for good, to shape my character. In short, you are spiritualizing away the big feelings that you would feel if you had stayed with the painful reality of the story of the 8-year-old girl. If you use the name of God to downplay the pain of your past, you are using spirituality to avoid feeling your feelings. You're appealing to God's goodness to avoid sitting with that 8-year-old girl, which is madness. You're appealing to the goodness of God to avoid drawing close to the 8-year-old girl, which is precisely what God would like to do with you in that moment. God would like to follow your friend's lead and draw close to the 8-year-old girl by naming how hard it was for an 8-year-old to endure that. You are evading the discomfort of your own story anytime you say some version of, I know God works all things for good in my life, and I can see how God was doing that even when I was being abused as an 8-year-old girl. Now, please hear me well. I am not in any way disagreeing with Paul's claim that God works all things for good in your life. I agree with, I agree with Romans 8:28. However, I am wanting you to grapple with the question, why do you need to bring up God or the Bible right now? Right when your friend was giving weight to your pain and empathizing with you and offering to be with you in it, to sit with that 8-year-old girl for 5 minutes, we minimize our stories by spiritualizing the ways that we were harmed so that we don't have to feel the big feelings that we would feel if we sat with the 8-year-old girl. Okay, a shift. Just by the way, an aside. What's the antidote? Okay. If you're minimizing your story, what's the antidote to minimizing your story? If we all tend to do it, if we all tend to say peace, peace, when there is no peace, if we all tend to dress our wounds as though they were not serious, what can be done about this? And very simple. The antidote to minimizing your story is the voices and the faces of other people. We each need other people to help us see where we are still minimizing the harm that was done to us as children. And I have an entire podcast where I talk about this. It's episode 150. So if you want more on how trauma heals by connecting with others, which is the title of the episode, please go back and listen to episode 150. In that episode, I talk in detail about the importance of the faces, the voices, the emotional reactions of other people speaking into your life and your story. It is essential for healing to have other people speak in. Now, before I end, I want to address one more category. Some of you don't believe your story was that bad because you experienced deprivation rather than overt abuse. You look back on your life and you think, I was never sexually abused. No one ever hit me. So I don't think I have a history of trauma or abuse. My goal is not to, I have no interest in trying to convince you that you were abused. Some people escape childhood without trauma, without abuse, but no one makes it to adulthood without being harmed deeply. Moreover, and this is really my point right now, the absence of overt abuse, I was never hit, I was never sexually molested. The absence of overt abuse does not equate with my story isn't that bad. Why? Because, well, what if you were never hit, but you were also never hugged? I mean, never pursued, never engaged with. What if you weren't sexually abused, but you were never touched at all? If you grew up in a home that was devoid of deep relational connection, that was devoid of meaningful touch, that was devoid of substantive words and conversation, how are you supposed to know that? If you grew up in a home where that stuff was absent, how are you supposed to know absence? The level of relational connection that you had with your parents was just normal for you. It was the way things were all the time. How are you supposed to know if you were missing something as a boy or a girl? Instead of feeling like, my parents were dismissive of me and unavailable, instead of feeling that, thinking that, it is far more likely that you will have a sense of, my childhood was all right, I guess. Nothing really bad happened. That will be your posture. This is so important to understand. If you were missing something as a child, you likely didn't know it then, and it is often very hard to see it as an adult. Why aren't you going to know that you are missing care, comfort, and connection? Looking back, why aren't you going to know that? Because whatever level of care, comfort, and connection was present in your home, whatever level was offered, was normal for you. It's just the way things were for you as a child. You didn't know that there could be something else. Whew. Okay. Thank you so much for listening today. If the podcast has been helpful to you, please consider supporting it financially. There are a variety of ways that you can do that, and you can take your pick from the ways by going to adamyoungcounseling.com and clicking on support the podcast. Thanks so much for listening.